In 1965, a woman walked into one of Australia's most formal public events and shattered the dress code without even trying. No hat, no gloves, no stockings.
So I hope not. I think fashion just changes back and forth all the time.
A dress cut 4 inches above the knee. By the next morning, newspapers were talking as much about her legs as they were about the race itself.
There'll be long coats and mini skirts underneath. I've got a long Zhivago coat, which I had in London last year. I think simply because fashion wants to change, so fashion changes. People want to change, so can't go up anymore, so it'll go down, I suppose. I don't care which way, really.
The backlash was immediate. Public figures scolded her. Editorials ran for days. And Jean Shrimpton, already one of the most photographed women in the world, answered with flat disbelief. "I wouldn't have dressed differently anywhere in the world." Within a year, the shock had faded. Fashion had moved. She did not stay to watch the world catch up. Jean Rosemary Shrimpton was born on November 7, 1942, in High Wycombe, Buckinghamshire. She grew up in the English countryside on a farm, loved animals, went to convent school in Slough, and later her upbringing had been rural in every sense. Nothing in those early years suggested a girl preparing for modern fame. Her family life was quiet and structured. The countryside set the rhythm of her childhood with animals, school, and long stretches far removed from fashion houses or photographers. She was reserved, horse-mad, practical, and far from the world she would later come to represent. Her way into fashion had little to do with a grand plan. At 17, after enrolling at Langham Secretarial College in London, she had a chance encounter with film director Cy Endfield near Langham Place. He thought she might suit the screen, and sent her to meet a producer, and when that went nowhere, he suggested the Lucy Clayton modeling course instead. Shrimpton took the advice, started doing catalog work, and before long, she was appearing in magazine shoots. To understand why Shrimpton hit fashion with such force, it helps to picture the women who came before her. Late 50s fashion still favored a polished adult glamour. Models were poised, finished, aristocratic in bearing, and built for a world of couture rooms, hats, gloves, and careful distance. The image being sold was elegance from above, not youth from the street. Shrimpton broke that pattern at once. She was tall and unusually slim, with long legs, a full fringe, wide eyes, and a way of standing that felt easy rather than arranged. In her own writing, she described herself as gawky, tomboyish, scruffy, and unwilling to become a carbon copy of anyone else. She often skipped lipstick, wore her eye makeup heavily, and looked less like an untouchable ideal than someone a young woman might actually recognize. That difference changed the temperature of the room. When Shrimpton met David Bailey in 1960, both were on the edge of something. He was a photographer from the East End with speed, nerve, and a taste for stripping fashion of its old polish. She was 18, new, unguarded, and far more modern on camera than the industry had learned how to describe. Their partnership turned into a romance, but before it became that, it became an aesthetic fact. Bailey saw immediately that her face could carry the kind of pictures he wanted to make. The work they made together helped push fashion photography out of the studio and into something sharper, looser, and more alive. Guardian and Vanity Fair accounts of Bailey's career both point to Shrimpton as central to that shift. British Vogue later summed up her appeal by noting how completely she broke the old mold of voluptuous, aristocratic beauty. And she looked young, direct, and current, which turned out to be exactly what the decade wanted. She rose fast. Editors noticed how easily the camera settled on her face. Photographers often said she required very little direction once the lens was raised. The quality that set her apart was not drama, but ease, a calm presence that photographs seemed to magnify. Magazine covers followed in clusters. Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, Vanity Fair, Glamour, Elle, Newsweek, and Time all used her face. By the mid-60s, she was being described as the face of the era, one of the first supermodels and one of the best-paid women in the profession. These were the years when the press gave her titles so freely that they almost blur together now. The it girl, the face of the 60s. What mattered more than the labels was the way women responded to her. She did not look sealed off behind social class or old rules. She looked contemporary. She looked reachable. That was a radical thing for fashion to sell. Even her own 1964 writing sounds like an argument for individuality over trained poses. She believed style had to come from something real in the person wearing it, or it meant very little. London itself was changing at the same speed. Post-war deference was weakening. Music, photography, magazines, and advertising were all starting to bend toward youth as both a market and a mood. Fashion had long sold aspiration through distance. Now it was learning to sell immediacy. Bailey's pictures of Shrimpton captured that shift with unusual clarity. He did not want the old stillness. She did not naturally give it. However, together they helped create a visual language that fit the city gathering around them. There is also a class story folded into their rise. Bailey came from the East End. Shrimpton came from the English countryside, far from titled circles and far from metropolitan polish. When they became symbols of the early 60s, they brought a different social energy into fashion. That helps explain why their images feel less formal than what had come before. They were not selling elegance from within the old social order. They came in from outside it. Shrimpton's appeal also traveled beyond fashion pages because she worked in that narrow space where beauty and temperament reinforce each other. Plenty of women were beautiful. Far fewer seemed to arrive with a look that suggested an entire decade had found its face. She gave editors glamour without stiffness, innocence without passivity, and sex appeal without visible strain. The camera picked up that combination over and over again. So did the public. Glamour naming her Model of the Year in 1963 captures where things stood before Melbourne ever happened. She was already central. The Derby Day uproar did not create Jean Shrimpton. It took a woman who was already famous and threw her into a setting that made her modernity look confrontational. That is one reason the image from Flemington spread so hard. It was not a nobody shocking a crowd. It was one of the most recognizable faces in fashion entering a conservative institution and forcing it to reveal its limits. Another part of the Melbourne story is how ordinary the dress itself looked by London standards. The image carries so much force because Shrimpton did not seem to think she was creating a scene at all. There were no jewels, no dramatic color, no sign that she was trying to provoke anyone. Just a plain white shift, bare legs, bare arms, and complete calm. That simplicity made the backlash look bigger than the dress itself. The scandal came from the room around her, and yet the setting was not irrational in its own terms. Derby Day in Melbourne was a ritualized performance of order, and the members' enclosure had inherited codes from British formal dress and turned them into a local social test. A woman who arrived correctly dressed was demonstrating more than taste. She was signaling that she knew where she was, what the room expected, and how one moved through that level of public life. Shrimpton bypassed all of it in seconds. It is hard to overstate how disruptive that would have felt to people who believed manners held the whole structure together. That is why the reaction broke so cleanly along age and outlook. Older commentators heard insult and decline. Younger observers often saw freedom, or at least permission. Even when people disliked the dress, they could already sense the direction in which style was moving. The debate around Shrimpton became a debate about whether social rules existed to preserve standards or delay the obvious. Once that question reaches the newspapers, change is usually closer than defenders of the old order want to believe. Shrimpton herself remained detached from the myth forming around her. In 2011, she told The Guardian that she did not dwell on the past, and she seemed notably uninterested in the BBC drama built around her younger self. That distance stayed with her long after the 60s had passed. The same distance shows up in how she spoke about modeling itself. In her own account of getting started, there is no grand language about fate. There is trial, awkwardness, advice from other models, getting jobs, being broke, and learning what the camera responds to. Even at the height of her fame, she described the work in practical terms. Modeling to her was a skill, a discipline, and a job. She did not romanticize it. She understood what the camera wanted and how to give it exactly that. That practical way of seeing the work also changes how her exit reads. Many celebrity stories tempt people to search for collapse hiding behind the retreat. Shrimpton's story feels more straightforward than that. The more she said about fashion, the more it sounded like a decision she had already settled in her own mind. The industry brought pressure, distortion, and attention she never liked. Life outside it offered more peace. What looks radical from the outside feels, in her case, almost calm. Cornwall was never just a footnote to the years when she was famous. It became the place where the rest of her life took shape. The antiques shop, the hotel, the grounded routine of daily work, the fact that she kept no modeling photographs in the house, all of it suggests a woman who had moved on completely. She did not want to live surrounded by proof of who she had once been. In southwest England, she built something more settled than that. Even the details people now treat as charming carry a sharper meaning on closer look. She did not publish an autobiography out of nostalgia. She did it because the hotel roof needed repair. And she did not keep stepping back into public view to tend to her reputation. She spoke rarely, and when she did, there was often a trace of impatience with being asked to revisit the past. That distance only deepened the image people held of her. The less she offered, the more fixed it became. Jean Shrimpton holds an unusual place in fashion history. She is remembered for setting something in motion and then refusing to spend the rest of her life trading on it. One part made her famous. The other set her apart. Many icons are folded back into public life through anniversaries, retrospectives, and endless commentary on their younger selves. Shrimpton kept away from that cycle. She left the photographs to history and carried on with her life. In October 1965, Shrimpton traveled to Australia during the Melbourne Cup Carnival as part of a promotional visit tied to DuPont and the Victoria Racing Club. She was there to judge fashions on the field and bring international glamour to the Spring Carnival, which was one of the biggest social events in the Australian calendar. Expectations around her visit were immense. Melbourne knew she was coming. Melbourne thought it knew what that would look like. The crucial setting was Victoria Derby Day at Flemington on October 30th, not the Melbourne Cup itself a few days later. Derby Day carried its own rigid social codes. In the members' enclosure, women were expected to arrive fully dressed for the occasion. Hat, gloves, stockings, polished formality. Those details were not minor touches. They signaled belonging, respectability, and familiarity with the rules of the room. Shrimpton was coming from a different world. London hemlines had been climbing for years. Youth fashion had already broken with many of the rules Melbourne still held tightly. The dress made for her by Colin Rolfe was a simple white shift, sleeveless and short, with the hem about 4 inches above the knee. Shrimpton later said there had not been enough fabric for the longer version first imagined. To her, the shortened hem was nothing dramatic. She already wore day dresses above the knee. She also arrived with none of the accessories Melbourne expected. No hat, no gloves, no stockings. She later wrote that it was a hot day, her legs were brown from the summer, and she owned neither a hat nor gloves anyway. She went downstairs from her hotel room cheerful and unworried. She had not dressed for revolt. She had dressed as herself. When Jean Shrimpton walked into Flemington with Terence Stamp that afternoon, the reaction was instant. Many who were there remembered the silence first. Conversations paused, heads turned. Then came the stares, the muttering, the careful social reading of every omitted detail. A short white shift in London was one thing. A short white shift in Melbourne's members' enclosure was something else entirely. The difference between the two worlds suddenly felt very visible. The hemline got the headlines, but the full shock came from the total picture. She had bypassed the rules all at once. No hat, no gloves, no stockings, a man's watch, low-heeled shoes, bare legs in a place still governed by older standards of female formality. The outfit looked simple to her because it was simple to her. To a conservative crowd at Flemington, it looked like a breach. Photographers swarmed. Shrimpton later wrote that they crouched low and shot upward, making the dress look even shorter in print. The pictures intensified everything for readers who had not been there. By the next morning, newspapers were treating the scene less as a fashion story than a public disturbance. One front page famously listed what she had failed to wear. No hat, no gloves, no stockings. The race itself was pushed to the side. What sharpened the story even further was Shrimpton's refusal to apologize. She said plainly that she saw nothing wrong with what she had worn and would not have dressed differently for a race meeting anywhere in the world. The force of the remark came from how plain it was. She did not try to soften it or dress it up. She simply declined to accept the criticism. The uproar did not burn out in a single news cycle. It ran for days. Public figures weighed in. The former Lady Mayoress of Melbourne, Lady Nathan, rebuked Shrimpton sharply. Maggie Taberer, then the most prominent model in Australia, criticized the outfit as wrong for the occasion. Editorial pages and radio programs kept the debate alive because it was never only about a hemline. It was about who set the terms of public behavior and whose modernity counted. That is why the missing accessories mattered so much. In Melbourne, hat, gloves, and stockings were part of a language. They signaled that a woman understood the occasion and had chosen to honor it. Shrimpton arrived speaking a different language entirely. She was not trying to insult anyone. She simply did not grant those rules the authority Melbourne assumed they held. The offense was cultural before it was visual. The British press saw the same event through a nearly opposite lens. Coverage in London treated her as fresh air moving through stale convention. Supporters in Australia also recognized what younger women were seeing in her. Not indecency, not insolence, but modernity arriving early. Even Zara Holt, who moved in the highest political circles, praised the look while admitting older women would find it difficult territory. The argument had already started to tip. A few days later, on Melbourne Cup Day, sponsor pressure closed in. Shrimpton appeared in a conventional gray suit with hat, gloves, and stockings, aligned with the code she had broken on Derby Day. The message was obvious. So was her response. She said Melbourne did not seem ready for her, that it felt years behind London. The line traveled because it sounded true. Jean Shrimpton did not invent the miniskirt. Mary Quant had already helped push short hemlines into London fashion, and others were doing the same. The Derby Day story becomes clearer when it leaves that point intact. Shrimpton's contribution came elsewhere. She did not design the look. She made it visible on a scale no one could dismiss. The white shift dress at Flemington took a fashion trend that was already gathering force and gave it a global image. That is what fixed the afternoon in public memory. The style now had a scene, a controversy, and one of the most famous women in the world standing at the center of it. Within a year, Australian coverage was already treating that hemline as far less shocking than before. Designers copied it. Women wore it. The shift dress itself was simple enough to reproduce quickly, which helped spread the look beyond fashion houses and into ordinary wardrobes. The pace of that change told its own story. In later summaries, Time would credit Shrimpton with popularizing the miniskirt by wearing that very short dress to the Melbourne race meeting. That is a fairer way to frame it. She helped give the trend its mainstream momentum. She made it impossible to keep treating it as something local, fringe, or safely contained in London boutiques. After Flemington, the mini no longer belonged to one neighborhood. The image itself also lasted. Photographs from that day continue to appear in fashion histories because they capture more than style. They catch a live clash between generations, cities, and ideas of womanhood. Shrimpton stands in white, calm and unbothered, while the culture around her struggles to decide whether it is seeing bad manners or the future. That tension is why the picture still reads so clearly. The strange thing about Shrimpton's fame is how little she seems to have wanted the part of it most people chase. She worked constantly and well, but later spoke with unusual bluntness about the environment around her. In her 2011 Guardian interview, she called fashion a high-pressure world full of dark, troubled people, and said she had hated publicity all her life. That was not the language of someone romanticizing her own legend. By then, she had long since stepped back from the industry, but the reasons were already seated in her 20s. Success did not soften her into a believer. Covers, photographers, travel, the idea of being watched everywhere she went, none of it converted into attachment. If anything, the larger her image became, the more separate it seems she felt from it. And she could be great at the work without loving the life built around it. She kept moving forward in her personal life. After Bailey came Terence Stamp, and over time the center of her life shifted away from the fashion world. The industry that had once seemed exciting began to feel smaller than the life she wanted to live. Other interests and experiences started to matter more than modeling ever had. By her early 30s, she was ready to leave the profession behind for good. There was no grand farewell attached to that decision. She did not stage a last act or turn her exit into a public event. She simply stopped making herself available to the system that had used her face for more than a decade. For someone widely described as one of the first supermodels, that choice had real force. She left while her name still carried enormous weight, and the industry had no way to soften it. Shrimpton moved toward the life she actually wanted. In the mid-70s, she relocated to Cornwall. In 1979, she married photographer Michael Cox in Penzance, and that same year, their son Thaddeus was born. By then, the center of gravity had shifted completely. London, fashion parties, headlines, and the old mythology of swinging London were behind her. She was building a private life at the far edge of England. She opened an antiques shop in Marazion. Later, she and Cox ran the Abbey Hotel in Penzance for many years. That became her real life after modeling, not a charming postscript for the press. In the Guardian profile, the hotel is treated without fanfare. It is where she lives, where she works, and where the old-fashioned world no longer sets the terms. One detail from her 1990 autobiography says a great deal about her. She said she agreed to the book because the hotel roof needed repairs and the money would help cover it. The reason is striking because it is so plain. There was no grand attempt to revisit old glory. She stepped back into public view for a practical purpose, then returned to her life. She also said there were no photographs of her modeling years displayed in her home. That absence says something precise about the terms on which she left. She did not spend later life curating her own legend. She went on. The woman who had been used to sell an era chose work, privacy, reading, family, and local life instead. It is one of the clearest endings any supermodel story has ever had. History kept returning to her, whether she welcomed it or not. Time placed her among the most influential fashion icons since 1923. British Vogue and later retrospectives continued to rank her among the defining models of the 20th century. A BBC drama returned to her years with Bailey and brought her story back into public view. Interest in Jean Shrimpton never quite disappeared, partly because she had stepped away so completely. What never changed was her distance from all of it. She did not remain in public life explaining her own legacy. She did not spend the following decades packaging herself for nostalgia. The white dress at Flemington remained part of fashion history. The photographs endured. So did the argument they set off. She simply chose not to build her life around any of it. That is what gives the story its unusual shape. Jean Shrimpton altered fashion in plain sight, then left while her name still held enormous power. The industry kept the image. She kept her distance. What remained in the end was a woman who had already seen how quickly the world could turn a face into a symbol and a moment into history. She accepted neither role as a permanent home. That refusal gives her story its final force. The legend stayed public. The life stayed her own. So her story unfolds in two connected movements. First, a young English model arrives in conservative Melbourne, shocks a nation, and helps push a new silhouette into the mainstream. Then, a woman in her early 30s leaves the spotlight behind and builds a life elsewhere, far from the machinery that once depended on her face. And that later choice changes how everything before it reads. The dress remains the image people remember. The life that followed gives it weight. It reminds us that influence and attention are not always the same thing.